What we're going to do is a two-piece lining for our hat that we just put together. And the lining will consist of a side band and a tip, and we want it to fit in here. So as we make patterns and go inward, it gets smaller, 1/8 of an inch. Just like when we put the fabric, it started to get bigger, 1/8 of an inch. So let's put this away. And I'm going to get the template here that we made originally. So here is our template that we made originally. Now what we want to do is make a new template and make it 1/8 of an inch smaller. So I have one here that I did. I traced around and I made markings here to make it 1/8 of an inch smaller. So then I'm going to go ahead and cut that off. And here is the template pattern for the lining, and it's 1/8 of an inch smaller. So now what we're going to do is take a piece of paper and we're going to trace around it. Remember to always mark the center front, center back, and the sides. You don't ever want to lose that. Oops. Goofed a little bit. So, tracing around here. I'm using the Sharpie to make it easier for you to see. And goofing a little bit there. Okay, so now what we're going to do, now that we've made it 1/8 of an inch smaller, is add a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So we're going to go around and add a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way. Now we want to make markings, center front, center back, and then we'll mark on this lining. You're going to put whatever size your lining is. So I'm doing 23 for myself. Now, what you want to do is continue going around with a 1/2 inch. And you can write on it 1/2 inch seam allowance. Or you can put a 1/2 inch here, so whenever you go back to look at it, you'll remember what you've done. So finish going all the way around this, making a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way, and then cut that out. Now let's do the side band. So this is going to be the tip. Let me write tip on this. And now we're going to do the side band. Now since I am 23 inches, and originally when I did my side band it was 23.5. So what we want to do is take 1/8 of an inch off of each end here. So what I did was I made a new pattern just for the lining, and instead of 23.5 it was 23.25 from here to here, taking 1/8 of an inch off. And then you still want a 1/2 inch on either side here. You want to make sure that it's on the bias. So marking the bias here like this. Mark the center front and the center back. And you can put whatever size it is. You want to make sure every time you look at this pattern, you'll remember what size it is. Put side band, and then we have a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around. Now, if you prefer, you can use your fabric pattern and then just take a 1/4 of an inch off of it to cut this out. Alrighty, now we have the side band and the tip, and we're ready to make our two-piece lining. So let's go lay this out on the fabric. Okay, now we have finished making our lining pattern. And the next thing you want to do is get your fabric out that you're going to use for your lining and find the bias. So here I have the bias, and I'm going to take my pattern and lay it down on the bias, and now we're going to cut it out. So I'm going to do this. So go ahead and lay that all down on your fabric and cut it out, and then we'll go over to the sewing machine and I'll show you how we're going to sew it up. Okay, so now we've cut out our lining, and what we want to do is take our side band, the ends, and pin them together. And I'm going to turn my machine on, and now we're going to sew this with a straight stitch. Make sure your machine is on a straight stitch, and we're going to sew the seam. Now the next thing you want to do is take this to the iron and iron the seam flat. And I'm going to turn this off while I do that and be right back. Okay, I'm back, and I ironed the seam allowance flat here. I'm going to cut off my threads here. And with the tip here, I had clipped into here, but so you could see it easier, I have put different colored pins here in the center front, center back, side, and side. So now what we want to do is take our side band here, and you're going to match this, the center back. Get my pins out with the center back here. And I'll use a different colored pin for this. And then you want to pin center front, center back first, and the side and side. I'm going to use another yellow pin now to put these together. And then we're going to go and do the side. And we're going to go over here and do the side over here. And what you want to do is now start putting pins in between each one, each quarter here. We're going to pin these really well. Get this to fit in there nicely. Now I'm on the third quarter, pinning this. Now remember, we're going to do a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And this 2-piece lining is called a tailored lining. Okay, now we're ready to sew it on the machine, 1/2 inch. Got some thread in there. Now what I like to do before I sew it is, you can see how they're not laying down flat. Here, can you see that? They're not laying down flat. So I like to go and clip it. Get my scissors. And I'm going to go around and do clipping so that they'll all lay flat. You don't want to clip too far into it because you only have a 1/2 inch seam allowance. But can you see how now it's laying down flat? So I'm going to continue cutting these, and then we're going to sew it a 1/2 inch on the sewing machine, and then we'll be ready to put this into our hat. And you're almost going to be ready to have a hat to wear. Isn't that exciting? Okay, so I went all the way around. And now I'm going to put this back on the machine and sew it a 1/2 inch. Now I always take my pins out. You don't want to sew over your pins. I'm going to sew this a 1/2 inch and continue going all the way around. Remember, take your pins out as you come to them. And if you like, you could always baste it ahead of time if you're not feeling comfortable with the pins in it. So continue going all the way around doing that, and then I will show you how to put this into your hat. All right? Finish sewing, and I'll see you back at the hat. Okay, we just finished making our lining, and we finished putting our crown to our brim. So now we're going to put the lining into the hat. Now this particular fabric I use is called bengaline, and I like it because it has a rib to it. And any kind of fabric you can find that has a rib to it, it's less likely to slip off your head like a taffeta also. So now what we want to do is, here is the center back with the 2 tailor tacks, and I have marked this to get started. And so we're going to put it in here like that. And so I'm matching the center back with the center back. We're going to turn it under and pin the center back, the center front, and the 2 sides. Now, it's important, got that measured perfectly. It's important that you don't go up too high with your lining so that you see it from the outside. So I'm turning this under a 1/2 inch, and then we are going to begin sewing it. And it's going to fit inside here just like a glove. This is called a tailored lining. So we're turning that all under a 1/2 inch. I usually have it about 1/8 of an inch from the top. And then the sweatband is going to go over and cover your stitches. We got this all pinned. And I hope after we get this done, we're going to put the sweatband in. And then after that, we'll put any trim that you might want on the hat. So I hope you've all been thinking about what kind of trim that you're going to put on the hat. Now, to get started, get a double thread, threaded with a knot, and then be sure to wax your thread. And now we're going to get started, and we can do a slip stitch or a slanted basting stitch. So I'm going to put this in here. When you first get started, it's a little difficult because you've got so many pins in here, and your thread wants to keep attaching to the pins. So as you go along, I love to take the pins out so that I can make it a little easier to sew it. Now remember, when I talked to you before about doing the slip stitch, we talked about going right above your stitch. So you're going to go right above your thread here and take a stitch and then come into the lining. So I'm going to take another, whoops, I see a little bit that didn't get, there we go. And you can also do a slanted basting stitch here also, if you don't care if your stitches show, because you can cover it with the Petersham. But I'm just doing a slip stitch here. I like the look of that. And so we'll continue going on and doing that. Alrighty. So what you want to do now is continue going all the way around, and I will meet you at the iron where I will show you how to iron your Petersham to put in here. Okay, finish sewing all the way around. Happy sewing, and I'll see you at the iron. Well, here we are at the ironing board, and we are going to iron our sweatband. This is also called Petersham or millinery grosgrain, and it usually has the little sawtooth edges on the end so that you can tell right away that that's what it is. Now it has at least 50% cotton in it, and that allows you to iron it in a curve. So I'm going to show you here with my iron, and we're going to start curving it. So you do need a steam iron. And you can see that it has ironed it in a semicircle here. Let's see if you can see it. There we are. You can see it's in a semicircle. And if you iron it and you see a sheen on it, sometimes you'll get a sheen from the iron. Then you can always turn it over and use the other side. So now it's ready to sew into our hats. So we'll go back and I'll show you how to do that. Okay, we've finished slip stitching our lining into our hat here, and we ironed our Petersham, and now our Petersham is ready to attach to the lining. Now what I like to do is, my head size is 23, so I measure this out ahead of time and I add 1/4 inch so that I'll have ease to wear the hat. And so I'll usually cut this about 1.25 inches bigger than what I need. And at the center back, we'll fold this under and put this on top of where we start measuring, and it will go in the center back right here, like that. Now, what I like to do is measure the center front. Whoops, that's not staying in there. So now I measured the center front and the side, and this way I'll make sure that it's going to fit my head size. Now here's the front marking. So we put it just above the lining. And remember what I had said before is you didn't really have to worry about your stitches because this is going to cover them. Put this in here. And what you want to do is get a single thread threaded with the knot on the end, and remember to wax it. And what we're going to do is a slip stitch. Now the other exciting thing is that when you're doing this, if you have a label, you can put your label on the inside here like this. Sometimes I put it on the tip of my lining, and then other times I'll put it here in the center back over my center back seam, just like that. Okay, well, I'll finish pinning that later. I just want to show you how to get started sewing this. And we've done the slip stitch quite a bit here in class, so you should be pretty professional at it by now. So this is a single thread, and I'm going to get started doing this. Now remember, you go just right above where your thread is, and that's what keeps the slip stitch invisible. And I take about stitches that are about 1/4 inch apart. Now sometimes I will sew this on the machine if I can get this under the machine without harming the brim. But in this case, I don't feel comfortable about doing that, so I'm going to continue doing this with a slip stitch. So I'm going to take another stitch here, and then it's going to be about 1/4 inch apart. And it should look entirely invisible. That's what's wonderful about the slip stitch. And of course, when you first get started, it keeps getting caught on all the pins. I'm going to take another one here. It's just going to be a little 1/4 inch into the top of the sawtooth edge of the Petersham. Okay. So now you can see how that looks invisible. And you can see how nice that looks there. Okay, and as I mentioned, at the center back here, you're going to turn that under 1/2 inch. That seam is in the center back. And if you have a label, go ahead and put that in. And now you'll be ready to put your trim on.